Welcome, everybody, to the Banyan Books podcast. My name is Ross McKeechee, and today I'm lucky enough to be joined by Bill Plotkin, PhD. Before we get into his formal introduction and our conversation, I'll just make a few announcements. As you all know, though there are people joining from everywhere around the world, the physical location of Banyan Books and Sound is on West 4th Avenue in Kitsilano, Vancouver. And this is on the unceded traditional territories of the Coast Salish people, including the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. So we thank those peoples and their ancestors for having us on this land. Now, Banyan Books just celebrated its 50th anniversary as Canada's leading spiritual and healing resource, an independent bookstore since 1970. So that's cause to celebrate. All of your purchases can be made, including Bill Plotkin's 4 books, at banyan.com. That's BANYEN.com. Please support your local independent bookstores. If you're in Vancouver and want to go in person, the store's open 11 to 7 every day, 4th and Dunbar. Okay. Our special guest today, Bill Plotkin, PhD. He's a wilderness guide, eco-depth psychologist, and an agent of cultural regeneration. As founder of Southwest Colorado's Animas Valley Institute, he has since 1980 guided thousands of women and men on the journey of soul initiation. This work includes nature-based initiatory passages, one of which is a contemporary Western adaptation of the pan-cultural vision fast, among many other processes, practices, and ceremonies. Earlier in life, Bill has been a research psychologist studying non-ordinary states of consciousness, professor of psychology, a psychotherapist, rock musician, and whitewater river guide. In 1979, on a solo winter ascent of an Adirondack peak, Bill experienced a call to adventure, leading him to abandon academia in search of his true calling. Our guest today is the author of 4 books, which are Soulcraft, Nature and the Human Soul, Wild Mind, and his newest book, published January 2021, The Journey of Soul Initiation, a field guide for visionaries, evolutionaries, and revolutionaries. His website is www.animas.org. That's ANIMAS.org. Today, in conversation with us about his latest book, among other things, please, Banyan community, join me in welcoming Bill Plotkin. Bill, thank you for being here.
Great to be here with you. Thanks for the opportunity.
So before we get into this wonderful book that you've written, mapping out this journey of soul initiation, the descent to soul, maybe you can just give our audience a bit of context for first how you came to this work yourself, and then how you came to write this specific book.
Okay. I got into this work because maybe like a lot of people, in my youth, I was asking questions about what's life about anyways, and why are we immortal, and what can one hope to do or accomplish in life. But the spiritual traditions, both from the West and the East, that I studied and practiced earlier in my early adulthood, were not helping me access some realm that I intuited was essential to being fully human. So I kept looking, and I eventually found the work of 2 of my most beloved teachers from California, Stephen Foster and Meredith Little, who were starting in the 70s, reintroducing the pan-human vision fast to the Western world. And that seemed like that might be an avenue. So at the time, I was in my mid 20s, and I was a research psychologist in New York State. And one winter, I went out to climb a peak in the Adirondack Mountains, and at the top, it was a snowshoe ascent, and it was a beautiful sunny day, the day after a great snowstorm. And when I got to the top, I was admiring the view, and then something totally unexpected happened to me. There was this immense ball of emotion that came up from my belly and out through my mouth as a whale, and I literally fell onto my knees in the snow, and I had this understanding, this realization that my life as I've known it was over. And at the time, I was in my second year as an assistant professor of psychology at a state university in New York. And my career was going really well. I was studying non-ordinary states of consciousness, and really deeply allured to that work. And but I just got this, and I was succeeding great. I was publishing in the best journals and so on. Had some great graduate students I was working with, but I had this sense that that wasn't my life. And I looked out onto this vast valley, snow-covered valley of mountains and rivers. And there was, the sun was gleaming off the water on the bend of one river. And somehow what I felt there, sensed, was that gleaming spot was, at least symbolically, something that I had to go out into the world and find. As in Mary Oliver's phrase, I felt called to stride deeper and deeper into the world, determined to do the only thing I could do, determined to save the only life I could save. So I hiked down that mountain, and the next day I wrote my letter of resignation and went out to the West Coast, to Oregon, and I spent that year doing a clinical internship in psychology. But mostly what I was doing was asking the biggest questions I could ask about life. And towards the end of, or actually at the end of that year, I took myself out into the Colorado mountains for my first vision fast. And on that fast, on the fourth day, the story is told in much greater depth in my first book, Soulcraft. At the end of that fourth, or towards the middle of that fourth day, I was in conversation with a spruce tree on the edge of this lake just below tree line. And at one point, the monk gestured to his left. The spruce tree had become a monk. I don't know if I said that. It's very clear that it was the true identity of this tree was a monk who had been meditating on the still waters of this alpine lake for many years. So the monk tree gestured to his left, and I followed his gesture and saw a butterfly flying in my direction, a yellow butterfly, and it flew to me and actually brushed the left side of my face as she went by. And I heard the words in English, cocoon weaver. And that to me, at the moment, wasn't any more interesting than anything else that had been happening that day. But I did write it in my journal. And about a minute or two later, again, one of those big, enormous, explosive balls of emotion came up through my throat. And I realized I had just been shown what my life would actually be about. It had something to do with weaving cocoons. And I had absolutely no idea at first what that meant. And I'm still learning 40 years later. So that got me into this work eventually. Yeah.
Yes. As a weaver of cocoons for others to go through their own transformational journey.
Yes.
And you do much of this work at Animas Valley Institute in Colorado. And you have many other people that you've worked with in the 40 years that you've been there, both people that come to attend your programs and other people that are assisting you in facilitating. What in how is you've got 3 books previous to this one? How has it worked up to this map that you have laid out here, which is, as you say, different than anything else most of us would have seen? It's got some pieces from Joseph Campbell's Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. That would be the one people are most familiar with, but it is something altogether new in terms of the map, maybe not new to the human experience. So how is it that this has been birthed, this book?
Yeah. Well, let me tell you a little bit about the journey of soul initiation. The muse just whispered to me about an hour or two ago this particular way to introduce it. So this will be the first time I'm trying this. She said, there's 4 interesting things about the journey of soul initiation that you should mention, Bill, before you even tell people what it actually is. And these are the 4. She said, when people just hear the name of the book, The Journey of Soul Initiation, most people will feel it sounds familiar enough and suspect they know what it is. But the second thing she said to mention is that although it sounds familiar, it's basically completely unknown in the contemporary Western world. And so that what people tend to think it is wrong. It's something actually different. And the third thing she said is that every human longs for this kind of the kind of experience that you have on this journey. But starting at, say, mid-teen years, everybody has a longing for it, but virtually nobody knows what that longing is actually for, where it's coming from. And therefore, very few people end up going on the journey because it's just not on our current Western maps. And the fourth thing she said to mention is that I'm confident that this journey, this initiation process, this particular kind of process, or some precursor of it, or something like it, has been true of has been an element of every healthy human culture from the beginning of the human story, and will be of any future healthy culture. And obviously I'm implying that ours isn't, and I imagine everybody would agree that our culture is quite decayed and psychospiritually, and a healthy culture would not be destroying life on our planet. So then she said, well, it's always good to mention what it isn't before you even tell people what it is. Yeah. So here's a few of the things that it isn't that you might think it is. It's not a rite of passage. The journey of soul initiation is a process that takes several years, typically sometimes many more, for those who even begin it. And maybe only 10 to 20% of contemporary people do even start it. And it starts with a passage, for which could be assisted by a rite of passage, and it ends with a passage, but that several or more years of the actual journey is not a rite of passage. Second thing she says is it's good to point out that it's not therapy and it's not a type of healing. That I'm a big fan of, and I was a psychotherapist for many years, big fan of healing. All of us need all kinds of healing, and we'll never be done with our healing. But The journey of soul initiation is not that kind of thing at all. In fact, you'd have to say it's counter-therapeutic. It's not a vision fast, although sometimes a vision fast is included in the journey, though it's not necessary at all for the journey. It's not shamanism, and it's not Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. There's some significant differences from what Campbell mapped out. It's not a mere nature connection experience, although that's so important to most everybody in contemporary societies, nature reconnection, but that's not what it is, the journey. It's not what we tend to think of spiritual journeys, or what I would call upper world spiritual journeys, which are deeply facilitative of our human growth, but it's not that. It's not a merging with divine. It's not achieving oneness or non-duality and so forth. It's not a discovery of our social role or our vocational purpose. That is not what it is. Okay, that maybe is enough examples of what it isn't.
Things that it is not, that we might mistake it for.
Yeah. Because that's the way everybody knows that's how our human mind works, is that when we come across something new, the first thing our mind attempts to do is to categorize it as something we already know about. And if it's something that's truly new to us in our own realm, then we'll misunderstand it.
Right.
Okay. So what it actually is, as I say, it's a multi-year process of initiation that results in our deepest possible human connection with the greater Earth community. And it also connects us with the deepest meaning and purpose of our lives. And third is it supports us, it enables us to provide our greatest gift to the world and to participate in the more than human world in the deepest way we can. So I'll just add one thing, is that one of the most direct ways to say it, but people often misunderstand it, is that it is the initiation process that leads to true adulthood. But we don't even have, in the Western world, we don't even have anything that corresponds to what I've come to understand true adulthood is. But I believe all healthy, nature-based cultures would have a similar definition. And my shortest definition is a visionary artisan of cultural renaissance. That's something that all true adults do. And but a slightly longer definition is it's a person, a true adult is a person who experiences their primary membership as being in the larger Earth community. That in addition to all the other colorful parts of our identity, including sexual identity, ethnic identity, religious identity, social group, and so forth, this is something a true adult experiences their primary membership as being in the larger Earth community. And they've had one or more experiences that have allowed them to glimpse their unique place in that Earth community, not in the human village directly, but in the larger Earth community. And third, a true adult is someone who's embodying that that ecological identity as a gift to their people and to the larger world. So last thing for now is to mention what I mean by soul, which I just kind of implied it explicitly. I've come to understand that we can't truly grok the word soul if we understand it primarily as a psychological or a spiritual concept. I've come to understand it's an ecological concept. And what I mean by it is simply the soul of anything, because everything has a soul, is its unique ecological niche, its unique place in the greater Earth community. And we humans, like everything else, are born to take a particular place and to have a specific gift to bring to the larger world. And that's what I mean by soul. And it's the source of our deepest meaning, because meaning comes from taking our true place of belonging.
Thank you for that. And you're really clear in your book. The glossary is quite comprehensive, and you make a big effort in the beginning to define these terms clearly, not to use them ambiguously, and that's really helpful. I think not just in reading the book, but for all of us to question how we use these terms and how we understand them. Um, Bill, maybe you can give us just a brief, very brief overview of the 5 phases of the descent to soul, or the descent into what you call Soul Canyon. Use that imagery and metaphor of Soul Canyon. And then maybe I can ask you a few questions about each of those phases.
Yeah, okay. The 5 phases as we have come to understand them at Animas Valley Institute. The first phase is preparation. There's a lot of psychospiritual preparation that a person would want to have. And that preparation is even after we've reached the stage of life when the descent to soul is a possibility. So let me say a bit about that
Okay.
it's always kind of troubling to have to say this, but I've come to believe that 80 to 90% of people in contemporary industrialized societies get stuck in what corresponds to the psychological stage of early adolescence. And by that, I don't mean our teen years. I mean the stage of life that starts at puberty and ought to end after 4 or 5 years, but for most contemporary people, it goes on for the rest of their lives, regardless of how long they live. So I've come to understand that most of the world is suffering from arrested human development, and that is the only possible explanation for why we're destroying life on our planet at this time. Okay, that's kind of a background, and there's all kinds of psychological and spiritual work to help us get through early adolescence and into what I call late adolescence, which I also call the stage of the cocoon. And the cocoon stage is when the journey of soul initiation happens. Okay, so that was background to say that the preparation for the preparation phase of the descent to soul, by the way, the descent to soul is one particular experiential and spiritual adventure that happens during the journey of soul initiation. The descent to soul can be as short as maybe a month or two, but typically it's a year or more, depending on whether you have guidance. Like Carl Jung's descent to soul went on for several years. Okay, so there's preparation activities. Remembering you asked for kind of a brief overview.
Yes. You're doing a great job. There's just so the audience understands, this is a lot to cover in an interview, and so I encourage everyone to pick up the book, because it really is wonderful, and we're only going to be able to scratch the surface tonight, I know.
Okay. So the second phase, which in the Soul Canyon metaphor or analogy, is when we've gotten, the second phase begins when we've gotten to the edge of the canyon. Preparation was like going through the forest to get to the edge of the canyon. And then we climb down, but the truth is it's more like free fall. We fall down into the canyon. And that falling, we call that second phase is dissolution. And what's dissolving is our adolescent identity, our familiar identity, who we understood ourselves to be, what the world is, what life's about, the whole thing, it goes. In some traditions, that's called dismemberment. And the third phase is when you're at the bottom of the canyon, and that we call soul encounter. And that's when you have what in the Western world we consider a mystical vision of who we were meant to be. Like mine was the experience with the monk tree and the butterfly and hearing these words, cocoon weaver. But it comes in many different forms. Mine's just one version, one type of soul encounter that came through an interaction with other non-human beings. Sometimes they come through dreams and so forth. The fourth phase is like when we're climbing out the other side of the canyon, and we call that metamorphosis. And this is one of the several ways in which the journey is different than Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, because he didn't have anything like metamorphosis in his map. But metamorphosis is when our human ego is shapeshifted by the vision itself, because the vision is not primarily information. It's actually more like being struck by lightning. And then there's that lightning changes us, you might say, alchemically. But what is getting shapeshifted for us is our ego, our conscious self, is being metamorphosed, transformed from an adolescent ego, which is an agent for itself, to a adult ego, which is an agent for soul. And the last phase is like when we're walking, we're back up out of the canyon on the other side, and we're walking through the forest back to the village. And this can take years, this phase, at least months, is when we begin to find simple ways to embody this new identity, even before we find a true delivery system to offer it as a gift to our people. It's the early enactment, that's what we call it, enactment of, or embodiment of the identity. So there's about the quickest overview I could give you.
Right. No, that was wonderful. Thank you. So just to recap for the audience, there's the descent to soul. Bill uses the image of Soul Canyon. We have phase 1, which is preparation. You're still on level ground. Phase 2, the dissolution, is you're going down into the canyon. Phase 3 at the bottom is soul encounter. And then you start coming back out of this canyon. It's your phase of metamorphosis, and coming back to the surface of Earth or the world is enactment. Okay. Now, just also to remind our audience, this is based on 40 plus years of experience guiding people, observing people, studying on the ground, real experience. This isn't just a philosophical or academic outlook. So phase 1, preparation for the descent into Soul Canyon. You talk about the non-negotiables in our preparation that are needed in our personal development, so that we have a chance at, you use the word surviving, a chance at surviving our descent to and our encounter with soul. What do you mean by, what are these non-negotiables that we need to have in our preparation?
Good question. Give me a hint. What are the things I mentioned? Because there's actually so many.
You talked about you've come to 2 conclusions: that a particular developmental stage must be achieved before a person is ready to embark on the journey.
Yeah.
You said also that relatively few contemporary people ever achieve this stage, and you kind of hint at that it's not guaranteed that we'll ever get to that stage of readiness for this descent to soul. And in a lot of ways, we can't control whether it happens or not. Even if we're preparing, it might not happen.
Yes. So yeah, that's something I was at least alluding to earlier, that one of the non-negotiables is that we're actually in the cocoon stage. Again, only 10 or 20% of contemporary people ever reach that stage. And they might not know what's happening to them even when they go through that passage, which I call confirmation. So early adolescence, I call the oasis, which is the stage when we're learning how to create our own social presence. Because in childhood, we basically created, we didn't even create it. Our ego forms as pretty much a child of our particular family and community. And we learn our parents' value system. And that's essential, that we learn a value system from somebody in childhood. But after puberty, we have to change our value system, at least somewhat, to fit who we really are. So discovering our deeper authenticity and our deeper way of belonging. In the current, there's a current movement. It's getting more popular over the last 10 years or so, called the purpose movement, where people are starting to focus more on this question of what is my personal meaning, and am I just going through the motions or just finding a job that I can survive at. And unfortunately, of course, there's so many people in the world who that's what their life has to be about, is about survival because of the conditions in the world now. But for us privileged people who can afford to ask the questions about purpose and meaning, that's almost always an early adolescent question that's being asked, namely, what's my social role? What's the social role or vocation or a creative project that is that embodies who I am? And this is really on the personality level, and it doesn't go anywhere close as deep as the soul level. But in early adolescence, which most contemporary people are in after puberty, it is essential to go through this question of belonging and personal authenticity. So all that needs to be completed before we get into the cocoon stage. And I think you might have mentioned, Ross, and it's true, that we don't decide when to go to the next stage, and there's no other humans who declare that we're ready, and so therefore we go. And there's no rite of passage that gets us to go into the next stage. But the way I like to say it is mystery says, okay, you've done enough work at creating this authentic social presence that is also gives you social acceptance in your peer group. We're now sending you over into the cocoon. And in a healthy culture, the elders would notice that that's happening to you. And they don't bring you into the cocoon. They just notice that it's happened. And then they would, and other people in the community would create a rite of passage for you to help you get oriented to the passage that just already happened for you, and to let the rest of the community know this has happened to you, and you're going to need some support because you're going to be totally disoriented for a while. And the rite of passage helps you understand what's happened to you. Okay, so that's a non-negotiable.
Right.
Another major piece is that to prepare for the actual dissolution, which is the phase, which is the free fall into Soul Canyon, we have to have cultivated enough of what I call the four facets of our innate human wholeness. Like each one of us is born, every human is born with these four facets that we've mapped onto nature's template, namely the four cardinal directions and the four times of day and the four seasons. And we don't have time right now to go into what those four facets are. Just briefly, I'll say that contemporary cultures suppress the cultivation of all four of them, especially the two that are considered feminine. And so those are the two that we most need to attend to. And you wouldn't want to make that descent, that free fall into the canyon, unless you had all four facets decently cultivated.
Yes. Just off the cuff, you mentioned the feminine. Is the suppression of the feminine one of the key pieces that's missing in our developing as whole human beings in this culture?
Yeah, exactly. The suppression of the feminine is part of what keeps us stuck in early adolescence. Um, it's a little bit more complicated because what I'm referring to as the feminine is, I believe, these two facets are an aspect of every person, regardless of their sex and regardless of their gender's orientation. But the juvenile, uninitiated, pathologically adolescent, masculine mind, which sometimes we use the shorthand patriarchal, thinks of these two facets of our innate human wholeness as not me, not masculine. And so it's not me, it must be true of women. That immature masculine mind will say. And so in our culture, our contemporary Western culture, we've tended to think of these two as feminine, but in fact, they're just two of the four facets. Um, and um, and also part of that patriarchal mind is the disconnect from the greater natural world, which has also been considered as feminine. That's not me. So just briefly, these two aspects of the feminine, they have to do with two of our four windows of human knowing. One is feeling, which includes emotions, and the other one is our deep imagination, the imagination that springs from our depths unbidden and through dreams and visions and so forth. And there's much more to say about these two facets, but well, I'll tell you their names. That the one in the south, which is related to our capacity for feeling, we call the wild indigenous one. And by indigenous, I simply mean the part of us that knows we are a member of Earth. Whether or not we had the good fortune of being born to an intact indigenous culture or not, that we have this indigeneity that's basically our rootedness in Earth and our experience that everything is kin, and our experience that every human emotion is a gift and supports us in our relationships and our growth. And the West facet, which is the other one that the patriarchal mind thinks of as feminine, is we call it the dark muse beloved. This is the part of us that loves the depths, the darkness. To this part of us, the darkness is fruitful and endlessly enchanted, including the process of dying and death. And it's when we say it's the muse, it's our deepest creativity. And the beloved is the inner beloved, it's the part of us that we tend to feel is at first is not me, but it's the inner beloved. It's the part of us that in a adolescent world we project onto people we fall in love with. And of course, that gets a relationship going really hot and beautifully. But if we don't own back that projection, it'll end up wrecking the relationship, which happens so often. Okay, so here's at least a
Yes,
early
that's
sketch.
a wonderful glimpse and teaser to want to learn more about that. Phase two. So we've if we get to this phase, if we have prepared through our own self-development, becoming whole as human beings, moving into late adolescence, as you call it. Phase two, dissolution. This is where we begin the descent into Soul Canyon. Can you let our audience know what can they expect? What are some of the possible joys? What are some of the possible horrors one might experience in this dissolution phase where literally our egoic self, our sense of self is being taken apart?
Yeah, it's like again being dismembered. It's not only do we lose our connection or belief in the social roles we had been inhabiting and any vocation or career or creative projects we've been involved in. But something even more profound is happening during dissolution, especially on our first descent, and that is we lose our faith that we'll ever be able to identify ourselves to ourselves in any significant or ultimate way in terms of any social role or vocation. That whole way of defining ourselves is gone, and that leaves us in a very deep kind of limbo, and it can be very scary, especially if we don't know what's happening to us. So here I should contrast this with what might seem like a similar experience that happens in early adolescence, which again is most of the life of most contemporary people. and that is something we call molting, which is an analogy taken from the life of caterpillars. Before caterpillars go into the cocoon or become a chrysalis, caterpillars go through a series of moltings in which they shed their skin and grow another somewhat larger skin. Biologists call this a molt or molting. And one thing that's true about moltings is that on either side of that experience, you're a caterpillar. And the analogy with humans in early adolescence is that when we go through a change in romantic relationships, or a change in our social circle, or a new job, or we move to a different part of the country or the world, or we change our religion or our spiritual practice, this is a molt, and we're early adolescents on both sides of it. So imagine the difference for a caterpillar between shedding a skin and growing a new skin, which is a very profound experience for a caterpillar. We have to imagine, but the difference between that and and being in a cocoon and your body dissolving into caterpillar soup, that's much more profound. And let's say you have the intuition as you're becoming soup that you'll never be a caterpillar again, and you're not sure what you are going to be. Okay, there's the analogy. I think that helps people get the difference. In dissolution, the whole early adolescent life is gone. And T.S. Eliot has a wonderful phrase in one of his poems. He says, "The cost is nothing less than everything."
Cool. So
that is emphasizing the terror of the experience. But the other part of it is joy, that that free fall is also freedom, that we're being completely liberated from that whole early adolescent game of developing social status and competing with others and so forth. That we're liberated from that, and we're being ushered into a world of mystery and enchantment that we know is much deeper than anything we've ever experienced before in our life. And there's a great joy about that. And one of the things I like to note is that a person doesn't start that free fall into the canyon, the dissolution phase, until their longing for the depths finally one day becomes greater than their terror of those same depths.
This is the call, is it?
Exactly, yeah. The call to spiritual adventure is what happens, and that's what I experienced in that peak in the winter and in the Adirondacks. It was soul speaking to me. I guess mystery decided I was ready enough. I was 30 years old, maybe 29 then actually. And this call to stride deeper and deeper into the world. And there's always the start of dissolution. In addition to the call, there's always the crisis. And the crisis for me was realizing that this career I had prepared my whole life for was not mine, was not my way to continue in life.
And you've mentioned in the book that one can consciously receive this call, or you liken it to like an abduction where one is pulled downward. What is that experience like?
Yeah, that has to do with the distinction that some people, when they hear the call, they say yes to it, and they might be fortunate enough to know what to do to say yes to it, or they might know some guides who can help them say yes. But in the contemporary Western world, it is so unusual that people know what's happening to them when it does happen. And 10 to 20% of people it does happen to. That's a small percentage, but a very, very large number of people. uh, mystery tends to take a heavier hand in those circumstances, and it's more like an abduction, as in the Greek myth of Persephone, who is abducted by the god of the underworld, Hades, who comes flying up through the surface of the earth in his chariot and grabs Persephone, who is at that time named Kor, which means the maiden, and snatches her away from her community and takes her down into the underworld. So yeah, abductions are more common than not in the contemporary world when people do get to the stage where the descent happens. Carl Jung was very famously abducted. He was minding his business more or less one day at home, where he had his psychiatry practice when he was 36, something like that, years old. And he was moved into, people would say, a non-ordinary state of consciousness. But what he experienced was that there was a horde of dead people that came to his house. And the dead said to him that they had just come back from Jerusalem, where they hoped to get their questions answered, but they were not answered there, and they demanded that he answer their questions. And that's in some ways how things began for him.
Now you reference Carl Jung's Red Book and have a bit of a different interpretation of it than many. Could you just give our audience a brief understanding of that?
Yeah, I was quite profoundly moved when I finally read the Red Book several years ago. Maybe some people don't know, the Red Book is essentially Carl Jung's journals of what he called his confrontation with the unconscious. It started a year or so after his famous breakup with Freud, which was his crisis, was part of his crisis that started his descent. And in the Red Book, so he worked on it from 1916 till about 1931, something like that. And what he was doing, he took his journals from the approximately 4 years of what he called his confrontation with the unconscious, and he transcribed them into a large folio-sized book, and he illustrated it with paintings and so forth. And he worked on it for something like 15 years. So the Red Book is essentially a version of his journals that he kept during his confrontation. And as I was reading, it wasn't published to something like 2007, something like that. So, which is 50 years or so after his death. And when I was reading it, at first I was kind of puzzled what was going on. And then the pattern started forming, and it became clear to me that this was essentially the first 3 phases of his descent to soul, his first descent to soul. And the Red Book, in my understanding, is primarily the preparation phase and the dissolution phase. Jung's primary process that he used for this descent was the deep imagination, which he called active imagination. So every night, after being with his family during the day and seeing his patients during the day, he would close the door of his study and he would imagine himself falling into an abyss. And then once he hit bottom, then he would have these enormously intense experiences, more intense than most people's dreams, that would go on for some time. And he was not in control, which is one of the primary features of the descent. The ego is absolutely not in control and is along for the ride, so to speak. And so his deeper psyche, through active imagination, was preparing him to cultivate the facets of wholeness which were least developed in him that he needed in order to go through dissolution. But more or less simultaneously, he was also having dissolution experiences, where his entire understanding of what he was, what it is to be a man, what it is to be alive, what the world is, everything was being shredded for him through a long series of experiences that took place over something like 3 years. And at the end of those 3 years, maybe it was 4 years, he had his first soul encounter, which is at the very end, almost at the very end of the Red Book, is his first soul encounter. And that soul encounter started when the horde of dead came from Jerusalem to his house, demanded that he answer their questions. And he spent the next several nights answering their questions. And he called this the 7 Sermons to the Dead. And he actually published it as a separate little pamphlet around that time. And what makes that a soul encounter is that he was placed by mystery or by soul into his role, into his, what I call his mythopoetic identity, his unique ecological niche. And that role, for him, was to develop and cultivate what we might call an intimate relationship with the dead, which he understood to be a way of symbolically accessing the unconscious. And so part of his soul identity, Carl Jung's, is to be the one who would bring to the Western world, at least be one of the people who would bring to the Western world an understanding of what the unconscious is and what its relationship is to the dead, to our ancestors.
Beautiful. Okay, so we're on to the soul encounter now, phase 3. What makes this phase, soul encounter, the pivotal phase in the descent to soul?
Yeah, okay, so the dissolution of our earlier former familiar identity has been complete. And you might say, when you first think about it, you might say, well, the goal of the descent to soul is to have an encounter with soul, is to glimpse something about our mythopoetic identity, which of course is the metaphor that helps us, that points us towards our unique ecological niche, because that's the way our human consciousness helps us understand our unique niche, is through a metaphor or a symbol or a poem or a dance, something metaphoric. So you could say it's the apex, but it's really the nadir of the journey. It's the bottom of the journey. And it's what going into the descent, it's what we think we've come for, and that maybe the descent will be over once we have that vision, but it's actually just the middle part.
Okay. So within this soul encounter, you mentioned in the book that there might be need to attend once again to our holing and our self-healing. How does this arise during the process of the soul encounter?
Yeah. The general principle is that the more we develop, the more we mature, the more we move to later stages, or in the case of the descent, later phases, the more wholeness we need. We might think as we grow into later stages of life, life becomes easier, but it actually becomes more challenging. It becomes more fulfilling and more joyful, but it becomes more challenging. And so with each new stage, or with the descent, each new phase, we need greater cultivation of our wholeness. And part of this is so many things to say, Ross, but part of it is that especially growing up in contemporary cultures, which I call pathological adolescent cultures, there's nothing wrong with adolescence. A healthy adolescence is a great stage to be in. But if you have a whole culture stuck in early adolescence becomes not a very healthy one. So let's see, did I lose my train of thought? Oh, holding, yes, okay.
Pulling self-healing.
Because we grow up in these pathoadolescent cultures, a lot of us experience trauma. And there's a lot of trauma to heal. And by the way, I come to understand trauma the same way as the Canadian physician Gabor Mate. You might know him, he's a fabulous author.
Yes.
The way he understands trauma, which is it's not what happens to us, it's not the overwhelming experiences and difficult experiences that happen to us, but it's what we do inside ourselves, usually unconsciously, to protect ourselves from the full onslaught of those difficult experiences. So the trauma is something, in a sense, we do to ourselves, and we do it for our own psycho-spiritual safety, but it also really limits us. And so healing trauma is a matter, in my understanding, of learning to embrace what we call our inner protectors, who are trying to protect us from fully experiencing in our bodies and in our emotions those experiences that were too difficult to assimilate. So as we go through the descent to soul, and more generally through stages of life, as we become more whole, we're able to access and assimilate deeper levels of trauma. And so in some ways, the trauma healing doesn't end, but we get to go deeper with it. And the healing of trauma helps us become increasingly whole. And many of the people we've guided at Animas Valley Institute, the experience of soul encounter, not to mention dissolution, is so intense that sometimes are which is say our inner protectors, come and try to rescue us from the experience. And one of the essential things for a soul initiation guide is to recognize that that's what's happening to an initiate, and to help them essentially press the pause button for a while and work on cultivating additional cultivation of wholeness, and also what we call self-healing, which sometimes is the healing of trauma.
Yes. Okay. Can you just remind us one more time? You have touched on this already, but just so everybody's really clear on it, what are the ways that soul encounter presents itself to us? You mentioned dreams, your experience with the tree as a monk, and the butterfly at the river bend. What are some of the ways that we can identify a soul encounter?
Yeah, so waking experiences, might say enchanted experiences with other than human beings, like in my case with the butterfly. Sometimes soul encounter comes through a really big dream. Sometimes it comes when we're in a trance. Joanna Macy's first soul encounter, her stories are told in this book. Her first soul encounter was just after she gave birth to her second child, and she was under anesthesia while the physician was sewing up her birth tears. And the altered state, the non-ordinary state that was combined, that was from a combination of having given birth and anesthesia and who knows what else, led to her first soul encounter. Very profound experience. And another way that it happens for some people is it's a sudden, like lightning strike insight as to the pattern that your life has been making all the time. It's a pattern on kind of a symbolic or metaphorical level that your life has been making, but you never really realized it before, that this deeper mythopoetic pattern just, it's like it's announced by your deeper psyche, and everything lines up.
Thank you. So we've gone through preparation, dissolution, the descent to soul, and soul encounter. making contact with our mythopoetic identity. Phase 4, metamorphosis. What happens in this phase to our ego?
Yeah, that's maybe I mentioned it before. This is the phase that we don't find anything like it in Joseph Campbell's map of the hero with a thousand faces, the hero's journey. And this is an essential piece, and we came to it, the understanding of it, somewhat late in our 40 years of working with people. And the way to understand how essential it is to go back to the caterpillar analogy. And so the caterpillar has its body has dissolved in the cocoon or the chrysalis. And then these, did I mention these yet? These cells that have been in the caterpillar's body all along, the imaginal cells.
The imaginal.
That's what biologists call it, because they're imagining an imago being the biologist's word for an adult cat, butterfly or moth. The imaginal cells wake up, and we might say they're imagining flight, and that's the soul encounter for the caterpillar. And then the imaginal cell's work is to take these recyclable materials of a former caterpillar body and to form it into a completely different creature, a butterfly. And that's metamorphosis. And if this creature were to break out of the cocoon, or if the cocoon was opened by, say, a branch falling out or something, while the caterpillar's body is still being formed into a butterfly's body, then what would flow out of that cocoon is just caterpillar soup, and it would go splat, and there'd never be a butterfly. So we humans are in a similar, incredibly vulnerable state after soul encounter. And soul initiation guides know that. It took us a while at Animus Valley Institute to really get what was going on. Because in our contemporary world, we tend to think, if we think of visions or revelation at all, we think of it as information. Like in my case, okay, my life is going to be about weaving cocoons. I better pack up and hike off this mountain and get busy on, the next day doing it, even though I have no idea what it even means. So what we discovered 10, 15 years ago or so is that some of our participants thought that they had to go right home and get busy saving the world by bringing their unique gift to the world, but they're not able to yet. And when they did that, they tried to do that, they went splat psychologically. And it's maybe the part of the descent to soul process that in which a person would be most vulnerable to suicide. So it's because they think they're supposed to be doing this grand thing in the world and they're not ready yet. And they might feel like a failure. So what has to transform during metamorphosis is, again, it's the ego, the human ego, from an adolescent agent for itself to an adult agent for soul. And it takes some months, if not years, for this to happen. And there are a set of practices we've developed at Animus that we call experimental threshold crossings, which is a way, these are the kind of practices a person in metamorphosis can engage in that will help them bridge from the revelation or the vision to the creation of the forming of an adult ego that's capable of delivering its gift to the world. And very briefly, an experimental threshold crossing is just acting in the world, in your human village, as somebody who has this identity, even though you don't know what it is yet, or what it means. Like, I was in the metamorphosis for probably 2 or 3 years, where I was doing my best to show up socially and also in my work life as this cocoon weaver dude, even though I really didn't know what it meant. but I was just like opening the door and asking my muse to show me like what kind of conversation should I have with what people, and what how should I show up in my community, questions like that. And these are threshold crossings.
Yeah. Speaking from my own experience, it's wonderful to have you lay this out so clearly. And having used to work in the shop at Banyan Books, I know it's the kind of place where many people would come in that were in that space. And
Mhm.
I feel very grateful to have had good mentors, teachers, and guides that understood and supported me through that process.
Right.
Um, how
Yeah.
important is that role? Because I've met many people that don't quite understand what's happened to them, but there is this sort of indignant outlook of they can do it on their own and they don't need a guide or a mentor or teacher. What would be your comment on that?
Yeah. Um, a, an utter guide who understands what's happening to you can make all the difference, and uh, to help you actually survive the experience, but also to help you go through it somewhat faster than you and more effectively than you might otherwise. But you don't have to have uh, an outer guide because of the last several hundred, if not few thousand years in the Western world, at least, as well as other cultures, people who have gone through this experience haven't had outer guides because there haven't been any, or at least not many. But luckily, there's two things we do have. One is that we often have inner guides that show up through our deep imagination. Like Carl Jung had no idea what was going on for him. He had no outer guides. He had a companion, Tony Wolfe, but she hadn't gone through the experience. And he had the support of his wife, Emma, but she hadn't gone through the experience. Um, but he had these inner guides, and for those who are familiar with the Red Book or even his memoir, Memory, Dreams, Reflections, his first inner guides to the descent were Elijah, character from, and Salome, both from the Bible, who he met in his imagination, and also a serpent. And then later, Elijah morphs into Philemon, and later on, still, Philemon morphs into an inner guide called Ka. So a lot of people have inner guides. Um, if they've done enough inner preparation that they even got to the cocoon, they probably are in touch with an inner guide or two or more. And the second thing that helps us out with metamorphosis is that I believe that this entire process is like built into our human psyches. It's something that on some deep level we know that we're designed to go through this experience if we get to the life stage of the cocoon. And so there's something that's, even if we don't have an imaginal guide that we can meet with, there's something that is whispering suggestions of how to proceed.
So the final phase after this metamorphosis enactment, you call this performing your vision for your people to see. How is it that in the enactment phase we become a conscious evolutionary who's able to communicate to a healthy, or sorry, contribute to a healthy and mature culture?
Yeah, the enactment phase with corresponds in the life of a caterpillar or moth or butterfly to that time when the butterfly body is formed, metamorphosis is complete, and the butterfly or the moth breaks out of the cocoon, but it can't fly yet. It needs to spend some time on a branch, um, pumping fluid into its new wings, and then starting to flap its wings. So it's literally stretching its wings. And this takes some time before the butterfly or the moth can fly. So for us humans, after metamorphosis, maybe at that time we go back to our village. Maybe we already have, maybe we haven't yet, but that we've got this new, this very, very new, incipient adult ego, but we haven't really used it yet. So in enactment, we begin to shift our attention towards embodiment. Like, what can I do, or rather, I should say, service? What can I do to embody my mythopoetic identity that could be of service to other people? And this is even before we choose a delivery system, which is, say, an art or a craft or some kind of discipline. It's before we usually find well, traditionally, it's we find a master in a particular craft, that a craft that resonates with our particular mythopoetic identity. And we apprentice to that master or to that group of artisans, and learn how to learn a delivery system, which can take, some number of years, at least a year. And that's what we do after the passage of soul initiation. Early adulthood is largely about learning a delivery system. But before the passage of soul initiation, we're still in the descent to soul, the first descent, and we're in this enactment phase. And it's before a delivery system, but we're just asking ourselves, how can I show up with others as I inhabit my mythopoetic identity, even before I learn a particular craft for doing it?
Mhm. Is it a guarantee that, having been through the first four phases, that we will actually succeed at embodying our mythopoetic identity? And is that a guarantee, or is there still
Isn't.
much work to be done?
Yeah, it isn't a guarantee. We can be in any of the phases and never get further. The descent can, let's say, for example, we're starting to go through dissolution, we're starting to fall into Soul Canyon, and let's say we have no idea what's going on for us, even if it feels right in some ways, which it may or may not. And the people around us who love us will notice that we're acting somewhat odd and disoriented, and they may encourage us to see a psychotherapist or a psychiatrist. And the vast majority of therapists won't have a clue what's going on for you, and they will actually try to rescue you from the experience and thereby abort the descent. That happens a lot. So there's no guarantee we'll get far enough through the dissolution phase. We might find a way to pull ourselves out of the canyon ourselves. Usually if you get too far in, it's too late to get out, but we might just be a little bit over the edge and be able to pull ourselves back out. Or we can have a soul encounter, but then leave the cocoon, or try to leave the cocoon too soon. And then we won't go through metamorphosis. And I mentioned before, that's a major problem. So there's no guarantee we'll get through it. And there's all kinds of trials and challenges as we go through. Again, it's a reason why it can make all the difference to have a map and or to have a guide to help you through it. So in some indigenous traditions that I've read about, for example, the African medicine person, Malidoma Somé, from the Dagara people in East Africa, West Africa, actually. He says that in his village, he only could speak about the boys' initiations, but in his village, there was apparently in any given group of boys going through the initiatory experience, which was of several months, there would be 1 or 2 or 3 boys that wouldn't physically survive. And which sounds horrendous. I mean,
Mhm.
not just for the boy, but for his family. But apparently, the Dagara parents will say the one thing that's worse than dying during initiation is never being initiated, and so they're willing to take the risk.
Wow. I had the pleasure of we've hosted Malidoma Sommet many times with Banyan in Vancouver, and
Hmm.
seen him speak, and his passion and clarity is wonderful. And the way he talks about his culture, the way he brings it to life for everyone is wonderful.
Yes.
Um, so this is again a lot to cover, and I'll encourage everyone to get the book and dive into it. Thank you, Bill, for taking us through that process. Now we've got a few minutes to just get to a couple of audience questions, if that's all right with you, Bill, and then wrap up.
You bet.
So apologies, everyone, we can't get to everyone's questions. We've had a lot, so thanks for everyone's participation. Jeanette asks, how does the Western medicine symptom of psychosis fit into your work? And what may be an entry point in this map for people who have had this quote unquote explanation presented to them for a vision embodiment?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. Um, like almost everything else that I've been saying, it depends on what stage of life a person is in. Um, you might say that everybody who goes through the descent is going through something that could be called by people who don't fully understand it a psychotic experience. But there's also something that people will call a psychotic experience, and that happens in stage 3 or even in childhood. Those are different kinds of experiences. But the Western world in general doesn't understand, I believe, doesn't understand to any depth what psychosis is all about. There are these non-ordinary states of consciousness that can be healing crises, but they can be actually expressing a kind of gift that a person is born with in order that allows them to access non-ordinary realities easier than most people. And in the Western world, that is would be considered something like a curse, because we don't really understand what it is, and then we tend to suppress those experiences with psychiatric medications and worse kind of interventions. But in a healthy culture, what we in the Western world call a psychotic break would tend to be considered some kind of non-ordinary consciousness that might bring a gift, is likely to bring a gift to the individual or their family or to their community. And one of my new book is, half of what the book is are stories of people actually going through the descent to soul. And one of the stories is of an extraordinary man who was diagnosed in his youth as having a bipolar disorder. And he went through the psychiatric gambit for many years on various kinds of medications. But in a healthy, nature-based culture, he would have been understood as in his youth as someone who had a capacity to be in relationship to the other world or the non-ordinary world. And luckily, this man discovered in midlife that what he thought was a broken brain, he had been told by psychiatrists, of course, that he had a broken brain, that he did not have a broken brain. He had a gifted brain, but he needed to learn how to use that power. And again, in a healthy culture, he would have been taught by, say, medicine people how to use that power when he was relatively young. So he was saved in part by discovering the discipline of some disciplines of such as Tai Chi and Qigong. And through that, he learned what in Qigong is called how to ride the wind horse. And this is the story in the book of a man named Kevin. And through that training, he learned how to keep himself grounded while he was entering these non-ordinary states, and so that he was able to ride that horse, not control the horse, but not get thrown off it either. And this was part of. This is just one element of an extraordinary story, but it allowed him to use this capacity of consciousness that he was born with as a soul power to which was an essential piece, has become an essential piece of his work, which has to do with the restoration of forests and rivers. He's an incredibly talented, gifted ecologist who has been working in the Pacific Northwest and other places, Alaska and the American Southwest, helping communities restore and regenerate their habitats. And his capacity that was once called a broken brain is absolutely key to his extraordinary ability.
Thank you. Again, there's so many great questions here. It's hard for me to choose, but this one really grabbed me, from John, who said, Bill, you said the journey or process can take years. I'm almost 70 years old. Is it too late to start a journey of soul initiation?
Oh, boy, I always like to say it's never too late. And we've had people 50s, 60s, and 70s who've been on the journey. But here's, again, the catch is we don't get to decide when it starts. And this goes against the grain of most of Western psychology, where people are considered to be adults at a certain age, 18 or 21 and so forth. And any kind of spiritual or psychological experience or process is available to anyone. You just got to, sign up, take the training or learn the practice. But what I've come to learn is that it isn't true, that there's 5 more stages of life after puberty. And if we get stuck in early adolescence, then that's the stage we have to work with. But if we are in the cocoon, if a person is in the cocoon, then, and they're hearing a call from soul, call to adventure, and they're in a certain kind of crisis of identity, then yeah, it's never too late.
Wonderful. I think we've got time for one more question. We're already a little bit over time. Thank you, Bill, for staying with us. And I think this is a good one to end on. There's a number of questions about our collective planetary crisis and how this journey applies to that, and where we're at as a planet, as a human population on this planet with this soul initiation journey or descent to soul. How would you answer that?
Yeah, I might have mentioned before, I can't remember, that I believe every major crisis on the planet now at root is due to arrested human development in contemporary industrialized cultures. That's where it all comes from, ultimately, because in a healthy culture, I mean, it just almost seems ridiculous to have to say it, but in healthy cultures, children are not murdering each other in schools and on the street. And a large portion of the population aren't addicted to drugs or other kinds of things. And politicians aren't bought by corporations who are poisoning our air and water and land, and that healthy culture is not making weapons that can destroy all of life, etc. This is not the way healthy humans behave. Uh, so, a lot of activists now are saying we've got to, in the next 10 years or so, get to a life-sustaining culture. And I think it's absolutely true. We do, because we know that we're actually a life-destroying culture, which is very bizarre. And I mean, life-destroying species. Most of our contemporary cultures are life-destroying, which is very bizarre because all other life on the planet is not just life-sustaining, it's life-enhancing. That's how life evolves and diversifies and complexifies, that every species not only sustains its own life and the life of its habitat, but it supports the further development and unfolding of life. And I'm absolutely convinced that we humans were also evolved to do that in our own way. It's just that we're in this several thousand year long initiation process, that we're learning how to be human and learning how to use our soul power, which has to do with our particular mode of consciousness in which we know that we know. So it's the loss of the initiation processes in all the industrialized cultures going back hundreds and thousands of years, having lost these processes, that has resulted in this incredible crisis that we're in now. So learning again how to invent our own authentic initiation processes, not appropriating or stealing the ceremonies and practices and maps of other cultures, but finding our own way to do this for ourselves is essential now. But here's the other half of it. It's not the most urgent thing. If we're ever going to get to a life-enhancing society, we're going to need processes that help initiate people into true adulthood, and then later they become genuine elders. But before we get there, there's these more urgent things that we need to take care of. And of course, there are brilliant visionaries and organizations around the world, as everybody knows, working on these things. And we always think of Joanna Macy's image of the Great Turning and the 3 dimensions of that. The first dimension of the Great Turning is to save as much life as possible while our governments and corporations are doing their best, so to speak, destroying life. And that's more urgent than anything, including the journey of soul initiation. And the second dimension of the Great Turning is creating the infrastructure, the new systems for a life-sustaining culture. And for me, a healthy adolescent culture is life-sustaining. And I believe we can't do that in 10 years. Who knows if we'll be able to do it or not, but it's possible. And we can, just with our strategic minds, I mean, we already know how to do it. It's, I think people know the kinds of things that have to happen to get us there. And Joanna's third dimension of the Great Turning is a shift in consciousness and values. There's a shift in our perception of reality. And I believe she primarily means what I call ecological awakening, which is we need a significant portion, hopefully before too long, a majority of people who've awakened ecologically, who've actually had the profound somatic experience of being as wild and natural as anything else on this planet. And that, in other words, to actually experience our innate kinship with all of the rest of life, and to fall in love deeply with the greater Earth community and not just our corner of the human village. So reinventing the journey of soul initiation is foundational to getting to a life enhancing culture, which is to say a truly mature culture, but it's not the most urgent thing. And there's so many elements that we have to change. And meanwhile, that's more urgent, that has to do with our energy systems, our food systems, our political systems. Just for one example, in a healthy culture, there is no such concept as a politician. What you have are elders who aren't elected, they're recognized. And everybody in a healthy culture can recognize a true elder. And the idea of having politicians who can be bought and sold, it's just total pathology. It's not what we would have. So there's a few thoughts. I hope that's useful.
Very useful. Thank you. A lot of challenges, a lot to deal with. It's the work of our time. And thank you for the wonderful work that you're doing, Bill Plotkin, and thank you for joining us today. A reminder to everyone that you can learn more about Bill and his work at Animas Valley Institute by going to his website, www.animas.org, animas.org. The Banyan Books podcast can be found anywhere podcasts are cast. You can watch the YouTube of these recorded live sessions on our YouTube channel as well, or you can visit us at banyan.com, banyen.com. Another wonderful interview with In Conversation. Bill Plotkin, thank you again for joining us.
And thank you, Ross. Been a great pleasure. Thank you to everyone who tuned in.